Okay. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are we all? Good. Excellent news. So, one of the joys of going around film festivals is that there's a way of avoiding talking about Brexit. So, other than looking depressed and embarrassed all of the time and crying in the EU citizens queue at the airport, it's almost possible to believe we're from civilized countries when we go to film festivals. So it's thanks to the Netherlands for putting on a Brexit panel. Cheers, that's great. So, and I think we probably should start by talking about what this panel isn't going to do. So I'm Michael Gubbins, I'll be chairing the panel, and I'll introduce you to my fellow panelists in a moment. But we're not going to solve the Brexit issue here, and I can't tell you, and no one you ever meet can tell you what the hell is going on. I always think this is like Fawlty Towers has been turned into a reality show, and it's all completely crazy. So we've got this beautiful English expression you can rehearse at home, which describes where we're at right now, and it's fuck knows. I have no idea. So none of us have any idea. We're probably right now closer to no deal and closer to staying in the European Union simultaneously than we've ever been before. So I have no idea. So if you want to know the answers, never ask anyone from the UK, because they don't know what they're talking about. And well, actually no one knows what they're talking about. So if that sounds a little, I've got nothing else to tell you. What we can tell you is that we're thinking about the scenarios here. At home, the great news is we've got a generation of brilliant, enlightened leaders who will help us through this difficulty, because we're still number one at sarcasm. See, you can never beat us at that. But we will look at scenario planning here. So we have Neil Watson here, who's strategy advisor for the BFI. Originally, I think Neil was taken on to look at the, after 2016, to look at the different scenarios, which he's going to present in a moment, for what would happen after Brexit. And 3 years later, you're still there. So this is a great way of keeping consultants in work, I think, and a good gig to get. We could probably keep that going for another decade, I think, before this all falls apart. So what this panel is going to try and talk about is what this means to you and what this might mean to you. Michel Barnier, our big fan, he's described Brexit as a lose-lose scenario, and I think that's probably about right. So unless Neil has something that he's not telling me, this isn't about good things, this is about mitigating the problems that might exist so far. So we will look at what those scenarios might be. The good news for you Dutch is that we were always really crap Europeans. So when it comes to what might be lost, we pulled out of Urimage back in the 90s. The levels of co-productions have been relatively low. So in lots of ways, that integration wasn't there. So you're probably not losing as much as you might have done if anyone had made the slightest effort to be European during the last few years. But oddly enough, and ironically, we were in quite a good situation with, so there are a number of Anglo-Dutch co-productions, probably more than there's been ever, I suspect, over the last few months. We have here one of the best, I think, in Dirty Gods, and we have Mike and Marlene who work together, and we'll go through that as a case study and try to understand as much as possible how we might be affected now in a post Brexit situation, what that kind of effect might be, some of the potential dangers. I don't think the scenario is necessarily as awful as all that, because there are things that we still want to do together. The British and the Dutch, for example, still have things in common. You sent us Dennis Bergkamp. We were always extremely grateful for that, and in return, for those football fans here, we sent you our worst football manager in history. So that's great. So we've got some things in common. We both like to beat the Germans at football. There's a big plus. We have hills, which is nice for when you come over and shoot with us. And the truth is that we remain a big market. We remain a big market, and in the on-demand world we're now living in, the access to those bigger markets, the English language is still a considerable strength. And having what is now the 5th biggest economy, it will probably be about the 11th biggest economy in a couple of years' time, but we still have reasons to work together. There are still reasons that don't go away in a post-Brexit climate, and I think there are reasons to feel that maybe there are things that we will always do together, but we will need to find new mechanisms for doing it, whatever the scenarios that happen over the next few years. So I don't know how you're going to come out of this. Hopefully you're going to come out a little bit more knowledgeable and a little bit more enlightened about where we are. What I'll say is that from my perspective, and I think we'll start with Neil, who maybe can share this perspective with you too, is in the film industry, there's no desire to disengage. I've never met anyone in the film industry who's a Brexiteer, but there are lots of different scenarios that still don't alter the fact that at heart, Britain needs to be trading. Britain needs that outward-looking approach. Right now, it looks like everything's contracting, but we're an island with a long history of looking out and sharing those cultures. There isn't any British culture for us to protect in the sense of something that's as narrow and Little England as perhaps some people like to push. So that's where we're at. Neil, maybe you could tell us where we are, where the BFI is seeing us.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Delighted to be here. Thank you very much to the organisers, and delighted to be here with my fellow panellists. Good morning, everyone. In particular, I think that it's very obviously timely here, but I also think rather appropriate to be here in Holland, given that the UK and the Netherlands, I think we share many things in common. We take a relatively liberal view of the world with some softish market interventions, quite a different view of the world, for example, in film and audiovisual to the way the French see the world. We've got a long history of cultural partnership, which, as Mike says, I think we can look forward to continuing, although there are some potential challenges ahead, which I'll talk about. First of all, just to say that I won't talk about the politics this morning. As Mike says, and you'll realise, they are exceptionally fluid at the moment. The BFI is a public body. Our job is both to give out funding, to help develop policy, but also to provide policy advice, in particular to the independent screen sectors in the UK and beyond, about what's going on in the UK. So I'll focus on some of the practical issues as we see them at the moment arising from Brexit. But just a quick word about possible scenarios and outcomes. I think it's important to remember that despite all the chatter and conversation and inflammatory statements out there at the moment, at the end of the day, there are three possible outcomes of the situation we're on. One is UK leaves with a deal. Second is UK leaves without a deal, a much more challenging scenario. And the third, which is not beyond the bounds of possibility, is that Article 50 is revoked and we don't leave. But that clearly would require a general election and probably a second referendum. So that's the backdrop against which I'm talking. The BFI is preparing for all of those eventualities, and we're trying to take as broad a view of the waterfront as we can. There are many moving parts here. What I want to try and do this morning is to focus on some of the parts that we think won't move, while also looking at some of the ones that we think potentially will, and how they might change. But bear in mind, please, as Mike has said, there's absolutely no monopoly of wisdom here at all, and please feel free in Q&A to challenge me on absolutely anything. Bear in mind, of course, that the only nation to have left the EU before was Greenland in 1985. It took them 3 years, and all they had to argue about was fishing rights. We're 3 years after the referendum, and we're still obviously deep in the complexities of how actually we do leave. A complicated situation, to say the least. So really, I want to do three key things. I want to put Brexit in context, and perhaps I'm going to be a little bit more optimistic than Mike. Mike and I often play that role where I'm a little bit more optimistic about some outcomes than he is. He's very often right, I have to say, particularly recently. I'm going to point up some of the Brexit challenges, and then I'm going to identify some opportunities for continuing collaboration going forward. First, some quick words about the BFI, for those of you not familiar with some of the detail. We're the UK government's lead agency for film. We have a turnover of about £100 million a year. That comes from three sources. One is the National Lottery, which is the bulk of the money. One is direct subsidy, so-called grant and aid from the government, and one is earned income. Among the things we do is give out lottery money to support film funding, also for distribution of specialised films in the UK. We support skills, we support training, we have the National Film and Television Archive, a very rich archive of material, and we also administer the cultural test for the tax relief, which now, to remind you, now covers not only film, but high-end television, animation, games, and children's programs. So a wide waterfront on the tax relief of gateways into UK funding. And let's be very clear, those gateways, both of lottery support and tax relief, are unaffected by Brexit, so they continue to be open. We also run the London Film Festival, which is about to open, and this year among the offers are two Dutch films, one Instinct and My Extraordinary Summer with Tess. Just a quick snapshot of some of the films that we support. As I say, it's a mix of production and theatrical distribution support in the UK. A little bit of context about where the sector is, which I think is important. The reason I think it's important, I think we need to pull back a bit from Brexit here and see it as part of a larger jigsaw, which is why I'm a little bit more optimistic than some commentators about where we're heading. First of all, we're in an era of absolutely profound change, as we all know, in terms of the audiovisual sector. Netflix, we're very familiar with now, it's an established player. Amazon is out there. These are players with serious global ambitions. I think also one of the key points here is that for the first time in Netflix, we have a player that is committed, unlike the studios historically, to investing seriously in local language production across Europe. Yes, it's on a buyout basis, so at the moment there are no residual rights maintained with one or two exceptions, but they are coming into this market across Europe in a very serious way. Amazon likewise. Sitting behind them though is a whole new slew of other players. Why is this important? In particular, it's because the revised Audiovisual Media Services Directive will require all of these services, whoever they are, wherever they come from, and when they operate in Europe, to carry 30% of European works on their services. Exactly how that's measured is still to be calculated by the Commission. We expect to have firm guidance by the end of the year, whether by titles and potentially by titles and ours. But 30% of the works on these services must be European. That's an enormous opportunity. If you look, for example, at Apple, it barely controls any content at the moment. If you look, for example, at Disney Plus, most of Disney's material obviously is from the United States. These services, unlike Netflix, who are ahead of the game and are investing in local language production, they need to bulk up in a serious way with European works over the next 5-10 years, and they're going to need to hit these targets quickly. This is an opportunity for collaboration. It's a different kind of collaboration to the traditional one of independent feature film production, but it's there, and its effects, I would contend, are already being felt. So there's some room, I would suggest, for optimism about a growing pie right across Europe, including the Netherlands, including other English language territories, but across the EU 28 in terms of a growing share of production opportunities at a local level. Just a quick snapshot here of the independent production scene in the UK. As you can see by investment, the numbers have been fairly flat, but they have at least been steady for what we all know to be an exceptionally challenging time for independent film, because in particular of the decline of pre-sales, related of course to the decline in television advertising dollars that are available to support those pre-sales, and of course the switch from a very lucrative medium, DVD, to a rather less lucrative one, digital, in terms of actual sales. How does that translate into numbers of productions, shown on this slide? And for those interested, the market share of independent British film in the UK is not that impressive at the moment. It's about 10 to 12% over the last decade. So some room for improvement in terms of connection with audiences. Bear in mind, it's also a rather challenging time for independent distribution at the moment, as the market kind of polarizes between these very, very big franchise films, which are taking up a lot of screen time, and much smaller pictures. We've had a number of independent distribution companies in the UK have either gone out of business or downsized significantly in the last couple of years or so. So that particular slice of the environment is rather challenging. So that's the backdrop. Let's now come to some of the challenges around Brexit. So, first of all, co-production, a subject very dear to many of your hearts, I'm sure. The UK has a good, but not great, track record in co-production. As many of you will appreciate, there's some outstanding exceptions, like Dirty Gold, for example. We have Marionette coming down the track, a number of other things. The good news on co-production is, with the UK, it is relatively unaffected by Brexit, perhaps at the margins in terms of movement of people, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The UK remains a signatory to the Council of Europe Convention on Co-production, and it has in fact signed, but not yet ratified, a new version of that convention, a sign of our commitment going forward. As I've said, the tax reliefs for UK film, including independent film, remain unaffected by Brexit, and it's broadly accepted across all political parties, and bear in mind we are very likely to have a general election in the coming weeks. All political parties now accept that those tax reliefs are exceptionally valuable in stimulating the production of both culturally British films and co-productions. We're also, as the PFI, currently evaluating whether the UK might rejoin Euromage, a topic of perennial conversation. We left Euromage in 1996. We are currently looking at the pros and cons potentially of rejoining. As some of you may know, Euromage is also reviewing its own governance procedures at the moment, so our review is awaiting the outcome of some of that. That's something we're actively looking at. The UK is also a member of the Open Method of Coordination group on co-production, which Doreen, I believe you're chairing for the European Commission, and we remain committed to being represented there, ways of making co-production more effective, having more effective policies in Europe. We remain committed to that so long as we are a member of the EU. Next important dimension, Creative Europe. Fantastically beneficial programme, not just for the UK, but for the Netherlands, I'm sure. We've been a very active member. The good news on Creative Europe, if there's a deal, is that there will be this so-called overall transition period in which we would continue to be a member of Creative Europe until the end of the current programme, which is the end, effectively, of 2020. Beyond that, the possibility, if there's a deal, of being a member of the next Creative Europe programme, because Creative Europe is not restricted to the EU 28, it does have third countries as members, so in principle, the UK could be a member of the programme from 2021 onwards. If no deal, much more challenging situation, we would drop out of Creative Europe immediately. this would have impacts on the money, for example, available to support the distribution of foreign language films, including Dutch films, in the UK, and it would also have impacts on the ability to support the distribution of UK films in countries such as the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe by local distributors. If we drop out of a cliff edge, as it were, we anticipate that mitigating measures of some kind would be put in place in the UK to provide a similar, but probably not identical, form of support. Some of you may know that a few years ago the Swiss dropped out of Creative Europe, and that they then introduced a shadow programme in Switzerland which provided some, if not all, of the benefits. Movement of people, of course, is a big issue around the fate of both EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the rest of the EU, but in particular also it's a business issue, of course, a business issue, for example, for co-production, people coming in and out of the UK. How will that work? Again, under a deal, there will be this so-called transition period, which will run at least until the end of 2020, but in all probability, given where we are now, I think the transition will almost certainly be longer than that, where the current arrangements for coming in and out without any requirement for business visas would continue. One would also anticipate that in a free trade agreement, historically the EU, for example, in the agreement with Japan, makes provision for the movement of people for filming purposes. And it does the same, incidentally, for the moving of equipment, camera equipment, for example, so it's not subject to tariffs. So one would hope that over time, once a free trade agreement was implemented, it would contain provisions around both people and goods, which effectively would mean things continue as they are for filming purposes. I think that's something that certainly the UK would be very keen to achieve that ambition, and I imagine the EU 27 would as well. Clearly, again, if there's no deal and we drop out over a cliff edge, this is all much more challenging, and the reality is that for example, the business visa regime is not a competence of the EU, it's actually a competence of member states. So if somebody from the UK wanted to go and work in, for example, Italy after a no deal, it would not be a case of an EU regime that had been put in place. It would be a very particular Italian regime or a very particular Dutch regime. So that's a much more unknowable situation. I mentioned also equipment and goods, because of course people do move things around physically for production, and here again no deal is particularly challenging because of the customs issues and the tariffs that attach to equipment and goods, and may be more challenging than people. But as I've also said, under a deal scenario, we would fully expect and hope that we have provision for filming equipment to be included in such a deal. Important point to stress also before I move on and close is when people talk about no deal, it's important to remember that's not a sustainable end state, either for the UK or the EU. It is the case that possibly the UK drops out with any kind of deal, but the reality is, at the end of the day, that the three issues that are in the withdrawal agreement, citizens' rights, money, and the Irish border, at the end of the day, those have to be solved, and at the end of the day, the UK has to have some kind of trading relationship, a deal, with its biggest trading partner, the EU 27, which is sitting on its doorstep. So if we do drop out with no deal, that situation will retain for a while. It's not a permanent state of affairs. I think it's very important to remember. So how long it will take us if we drop out with no deal to get to a deal is a moot point. It would unquestionably take longer, perhaps as long as 5 or even more years, but it's important to bear that in mind. No deal is not going to be a permanent state of affairs. So just to close up and to look forward, if not to the sunlit uplands, at least to scope for a bit more hope, The UK, the BFI, will remain a very active partner in the European Film Agency directors, of which the Netherlands Film Fund and Doyen in particular is a very active member there. This is an association of all the public funds in Europe. We work very closely together as a team, as funds. We have 34 members, not just from the EU. We're very focused at the moment on a vision paper, which we'll shortly be publishing, about the vision for European film in 2030. We also have working groups on gender equality and on film education, and we're just beginning a piece of work to look at ways of making independent production in Europe more sustainable. So that's something that's very, very important to the BFI to continue working with colleagues there. I would also point out a number of other potential areas for cooperation going forward. Again, if there's a deal, both the UK side and the EU27 have agreed that there will be a so-called cultural cooperation agreement, which will include AV. This probably won't include co-production. What exactly does include TBC, probably more around the kind of cultural area of, for example, collaboration between festivals, collaboration between archives, so on and so forth. So that's one thing that's on the table. We think that there are other areas absolutely where we must work very closely together going forward, quite regardless of the institutional arrangements around the EU. The first is unquestionably the biggest challenge of our time and for coming generations, that's climate change. For example, in the UK, we're already a number of initiatives around making production more environmentally sustainable. Those kinds of things are clearly only going to accelerate across Europe in the coming years, particularly with a new commission and a new president who is very focused on the objective of a climate neutral economy over time. Very, very important societal issue. A second very important issue where we think we can continue to collaborate is around diversity and inclusion. So the BFI has developed these diversity standards, which are now mandatory, incidentally, for our lottery funding. They're not about quotas, but they are about trying to ensure that the workforce, both in front of the screen and behind the screen, is much more representative of the society which provides the public funding for these films in the first place. It's something that the BFI in particular is very committed to, diversity and inclusion, and that we have talked to our partners around Europe about this. It's also important, of course, because one of the causes of Brexit and populism across Europe as a whole is, of course, the sense of people who don't feel included, who feel left behind. We're in a growing industry where there are fantastic opportunities for people to take up new jobs and new growth. We're not in a declining manufacturing industry, so we ought to be reaching out to be as diverse and inclusive as contemporary Europe as we possibly can. And I think together we can do that. We're probably not doing enough on that at the moment. The third area where I suggest we can collaborate, and this is not something directly for the screen sectors, but I think it's very, very important, is around the area of tech regulation. What do I mean by that? I mean that up until now, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and I don't include Netflix in this, have basically operated without much of a regulatory framework. The internet is no longer the Wild West. There are elements of it that still are. But the reality is that these companies have sucked data, advertising euros, dollars, and pounds out of our industry. One of the problems that, for example, one of the reasons behind the decline in pre-sales, as I mentioned, is the decline of the license fee that public service broadcasters and private broadcasters can pay for our films. Why? Because the advertising euros have migrated to these online services who are not on a level playing field when it comes to regulation that applies, for example, basic regulation to public service broadcasters and to private ones. One of the things that I'm questioning, I think we're going to see going forward with the new European Commission, particularly with Vice President Vestager, is much more effective regulation of these platforms. Perhaps not especially in our area, but just the overall fact that they'll be subject to more regulation, to a more level playing field, means that they can't continue to drain eyeballs and money away from our sector in the way that it's been happening. It'll obviously be very important for London as well as Brussels to work on that, and I think that's an area that we will collaborate on. So, to conclude, the BFI on its website, for those interested in more detail on any of the aspects that I've talked about, practical advice, has a link there, but if you put BFI Brexit into Google and bring that link up, runs through many of the issues that I've talked about in more detail, as well as many others. My concluding note, contrary to Mike, if I may, is one of more optimism. I think the opportunities for collaboration, for co-production, Brexit or no Brexit, are greater than ever. If there is Brexit, when there's Brexit, it becomes more important for the UK to be an active co-producer in Europe, working closely with people such as yourselves. That becomes incredibly important to establish that we remain part of Europe, whatever the institutional arrangements may be. There is this wall of money coming into Europe. Yes, the terms may be difficult. The terms may not be what we want at first in terms of buyouts and so on. But I would say, at the end of the day, even if the means of collaborating with the UK is changing, the ends that we both want remain. To make some films that make some money and find audiences, and to make some films that have cultural significance and enhance cultural diversity across Europe. There's everything to play for. Thank you.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the case study. Instantly, I think we agree on that last point. I think the difference is less about pessimism and optimism and more about that's a very strong rational argument, and rationality seems to be the thing going out of the window recently. So who knows? But I think here's a great case study that we can move straight into, I think, of where the value of that cooperation can clearly be demonstrated. And as I said, what's great with Mike and Marlene here is when we talk through Dirty Gold is here's what can happen when we get it right. So who wants to start? Do you want to show the trailer?
Should we show the trailer just to set the context?
This is what we're talking about, Dirty God. Anyone seen Dirty God? Pretty good.
Yeah.
What if I give you like a
Big night? Where's your mask?
Healed well, Jade. We're really pleased with your progress.
This was a particularly violent and horrible crime.
We need to see how things settle over the next 18 months or so. So I'm left with this fucking dog's dinner.
I swear to God, Jade, one of these days I'm going to be happy about money.
Plastic surgery go wrong for you, love?
Oh, this is a clinic online that can fix my face.
You don't know what you put me through, because all you ever think about is Jade.
I was still in hospital and my mum brought Ray to see me for the first time. And she comes in, she goes, monster. My mum, she's like, it's a nice monster, Ray. I'm damned.
You ain't damned. Oh, what happened to you? It ain't got nothing to do with God, you know.
To look and see that he destroyed you.
He didn't, Mum. He didn't.
whole film now, which is good. Okay. If you could just to give us, just run us through how the co-production, it's a 4-country co-production, isn't it? So who's going to start
Marlene's
with?
the architect, I would say. So I think.
Yeah, I think from a very early stage we felt that we wanted to make this film in the UK because of the acid attack numbers that are really went through the roof there. I think 460 cases only last year. So then Sasha told me, I really want to set the film there, and I said, well, I have no clue if we can find money there because it's so difficult to co-produce with the UK, but let's give it a try. And then we found Mike. And we went to the BFI. And maybe you can tell a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I met Sasha and Marlene in 2015, I think, and told me about the project. We took it to Isabel at the time, who was, you already had development funding from Netherlands.
Yes.
And so we took it to Isabel Davis's sort of relatively new fund, I think, which was International Co-Productions.
She was former head of international at the BFI.
Yeah. And then we were accepted into their development fund, so that sort of got the ball rolling with the BFI. The production financing was happening from Netherlands. I think when we first came, it was quite I think you were looking for about 200, 300, something like that.
We didn't know yet what
Yeah.
it would be, and we also had no experience with the UK in that sense. When you see other co-production possibilities, it's usually around 200, 250,000 euro you can get through a local fund. But then I started to do some research, and we found out that there were co-productions who got a lot more at the BFI. So
The Lobster was the one.
The Lobster was the one. And then we said, we are not Yorgos Lanthimos, but maybe why don't we give it a try? And I think in that sense also maybe the Brexit, we went straight through Brexit. The day after the no, we were at the BFI and everyone was devastated. And I think maybe they also thought, this is a very good case to prove that we want to be part of Europe and that we, it was not the main thing, I believe, but I felt that it
Yeah, I think it did sort of galvanise everyone a bit. And then we also had, we were able to bring BBC Films in as well, which was, that tipped us into a sort of, just a bigger chunk of money from the UK as well.
Yeah, and that was also because I think the most challenging when you looked at this whole financing structure and the whole co-production structure was that besides the UK and the Netherlands, we also had Belgium and Ireland. And as you might all know, it's very important to see how you spend the money that you get. A lot of the countries where we applied had spending obligations. So we were really in it until here and really struggling because we had a 5th country where we needed to shoot Morocco, where we didn't get a single penny. So we needed to spend more in countries. And and I think the BBC really saved us in that sense because that money was spending free and we could spend it everywhere.
Yeah, and it just obviously, and we weren't looking for more commercial money as well, which was but yeah, they did. And they cash flowed the tax credit.
Yes.
But with this film, just going right back to the basics here, would this film have got made without that financial model you put in place, that co-production?
No, I don't think so. I also kept saying to Sasha, that the director, that this is really the only way we can make the film. And she sometimes really hated it because I forced her to shoot all the exteriors in London and all the interiors in the Netherlands because of these spending obligations. And I think it's really something to be aware of, that those consequences are really huge. It could have really made the film bad, I think. And I only realized that more after, because we worked with a non-professional actress, and 10 days in London we only did walks. And then we came to the Netherlands and we had to finish all the scenes that we started there. And I think that is really something, we were lucky that Vicky is so great and that Sasha is a fantastic director, I think, and that she could pull that off. But it is something to really be aware of. I think it's very important. We live in a time now where we can't do without co-production anymore. We need it. But it's also something to really be aware of, that it's so important that you really think of those spending obligations. And with this film, for instance, we had almost no money coming from the market. There was no Dutch broadcaster here because they said it's English language, so that's very problematic. We had a really small MG from a Benelux distributor. So I think, we are now in a time where we, with the Producers Association, with the Film Fund, we are really fighting to get a levy system here in place, where also exhibitors and VOD platforms like Netflix or Amazon or Disney will be responsible for paying also towards the production and to be part of the financing of the production. And I think that is something that we really need to look so closely at, and that would be so important in order to keep making this kind of films and not lose a lot on production value.
And I think slightly tied to that is how difficult physical production is becoming in London because of that. So I think you're absolutely right. It should be.
And it's not an unimportant point, although it's not specifically about Brexit. The reality is that you're painting, and I hear this from lots of independent producers now, is in order to create the scale for the kind of film that you're looking for, co-production is going to become more important, not less important. And the mechanisms for supporting that are going to become essential. So, I take that point. Why was the English language something that you're talking about acid attacks and so on? But was the English language and the potential market reach beyond Europe, was that something that was in your mind in looking to work with the UK?
Yeah, I think it was a nice extra in that sense, and we really felt that it would give opportunities for Sasha to develop herself as a director, to come into this second level of directing, and to be able to enter a different market. And I think also, I know that Sundance, where we premiered the film, it was maybe also a bit easier to get there. I know they knew Sasha's previous work, but that it was now English language, I think made a difference. It made the film bigger, I think.
Yeah, which again, I think it's very important when we're looking at Britain's role in the world. That has been one of the key roles that Brexit potentially threatens, is that idea that we're the gateway, the gateway to those bigger markets. Not just the US, but also I think a lot of those, the Chinese market and so on. There's that feeling that working with us is there. It would be really useful just quickly if you just explain the structure of the co-productions. How much UK money was in there compared to the others?
We had £500,000 from the BFI, 200,000 from the BBC, and around 140,000 from the tax credits. So 850, I think, in total. The Netherlands, I don't know it exactly by heart, but I think 45% came from the Netherlands, a bit below 30% from the UK, 20% from Belgium, and 10% from Ireland. Do I count 100 then? I think so. And we had Hiermee on board, but that was, I think, it was really great, I think, because I felt I really wanted to have Hiermee on board of this film. It is a quality label, and also in the fight with Isabel, which Isabel started, I think, to get the UK back into Hiermee, it was really very good for us that it was part of the film. And
you reminded us actually that BBC were saying, well, look, why don't you just get rid of Hiermee money and we'll put that up instead. Yeah, they wanted that because that was the thing, that the BFI and the BBC were now not equal in the film, and that was a bit tricky for them. So then the BBC said, yeah, that little fund called Hiermee, can't we get rid of that, or can't we kick out Ireland?
I mean, the strings attached to all those kind of money. Just quick on the Hiermee, there's presumably a level of UK involvement before it becomes a problem for Hiermee. Yeah, 30%. I think we were at 29.9 or something like that. So that was also why we could not accept more money from the BBC, because we would top it and then lose Hiermee. And I also really felt the total budget was a bit below €3 million, and I
also really felt it was a good budget for the kind of film that we wanted to make.
Yeah. I'm trying to understand where Brexit, when I think through that wouldn't be affected by Brexit at all. When you look at Brexit, when you look at the potential, you listen to Neil's presentation, where in the production that you put together would you see the potential dangers in doing it again?
I mean, for me, it was the first European co-production I've been involved in. So it's actually quite the reverse for me, I think, in the sense that I'm looking to do more with Marlene and Sasha, and have since started to look at other possibilities. And it is down to necessity as well. I was thinking about Catch Me Daddy, the film that you and Marlene, that you and Sasha watched, that first put us in touch. And for that, when I put the finance together for that, we had a £200,000 MG from Studio Kanaal for the UK distribution, and that would clearly never happen now. So I think it's just become, for these kinds of films, it seems it's got to happen. So producers are going to have to find ways of making it work. But I can't see. Yeah, I mean, we're still planning to go ahead and do things.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's a bit easier for us now because we made this first film in the UK. I think the international co-production money of the BFI is still not clear what is happening with it now, but we could now go directly to the BFI, I believe. Yeah. That would be the plans for the next film. And I think I'm not afraid. I'm also not afraid of what it means for travel or logistics, or because there will be ways, and it might be a bit messy, but on the other hand, maybe it also lasts 5 more years. So I think we should prove that I think it's the best thing to fight Brexit, or the whole idea behind Brexit, to show that we can work together and that we can make beautiful things in working together.
And this seems to me that Neil's optimism at the beginning, this is where it comes together, because actually there was probably more opportunities to work with the UK than was previously being accessed. You know, people thought that the UK weren't very interested, producers hadn't necessarily got that experience of co-production, and that sense, potentially with a more progressive approach, because governments, even in a post-Brexit period, may be looking at this and thinking, economically, this is good for us, and culturally, this is good for us. So theoretically, this could be you're almost painting a picture where Brexit might actually at least concentrate minds on the international market, and may to that extent have some benefits.
Yeah, I think the same. I think probably the thing you found most difficult was in terms of the financial closing and the legals that we get tied up with in the UK. That's not going to change, I guess.
No, that might be more problematic, but we did it once, so we can do it again. but that, I mean, we can all talk about public sector obligations anywhere in the world. I mean, there's always strings attached, and what you're talking about with your co-production is you're constantly trying to navigate the different financiers, find out how to get good at giving them just enough of what they want to be able to tick their boxes. Does anyone, do you have anything else to add on? Because it would be useful just with the last 5 minutes, just to get any questions, if anyone has them, to you or to Neil. Is anyone working with UK co-production at the moment? Nothing at all out there at all? Anyone getting their films distributed or concerned about the distribution of their work afterwards, or from a policy perspective?
We're very open for business. So if you're not considering the UK, absolutely please, despite the newspaper headlines, do consider it. Continue to consider it for the reasons we've described.
And I think it's quite remarkable that to get around €850,000 from a country on a co-production. I never had that before, and I think, and there were back then also still no spending obligations, which is also quite special. Also, the BFI doesn't have it, but we needed to shoot, of course, a lot in London, so we spent it anyhow. But no, I think, yeah.
Okay, just a quick question to Neil. Will British film qualify as European, whatever happens? Because there's some concern that after Creative Europe, we won't qualify necessarily as European film anymore, which has implications for distributors and so on.
So just to be clear about this, British films currently qualify as European works and will continue to do so whatever the outcome of Brexit, even under a no deal, because we are a party to the European Convention on Transfrontier Television, which is a Council of Europe instrument, our works will continue to qualify as European, and there is no downside to working with us on that dimension.
Okay, well, I've been told I'm going to... oh, there's a question there. Perfect. Just, do you want to shout and I'll translate?
Very quick. My name wasn't quite sure if so now you can go to the BFI without an English co-producer?
No, I will never go to the BFI without Mike. No. It's now they had this international co-production money, but now it's Isabel Davis left to Scottish Screen, and it's not so clear what's happening with this international co-production money. But I think because we are now part of the UK, Sasha and Mike and myself, I think in a way, because of making Dirty God like that, it would be easier for us to go directly to the BFI and be in the UK directors pool in a way.
Yeah, and
Do
I think
say
also
it correct?
yeah, and I think also it's also that thing of opening up a relationship with BBC Films as well, because they are clearly interested in what Sasha does next. So that's been a very good byproduct to coming to the UK.
Yeah, I think it's great. We feel very warmly welcomed there in that sense, and yeah, I don't see a lot of practical issues yet. Let's see.
Okay, so we're ending on some relatively good news. Doesn't feel like good news when you're in the UK. I can tell you everything feels like bad news right now. But I think what Neil has pointed to and what this panel has pointed to is, look, it's still a huge economy. It's not Greenland, because the Greenland film industry collapsed after it left Europe. There's almost no decent Greenland films coming out in the festivals anymore. But for the UK, I think it may be that an understanding that you can't get off the world. You know, those changes in the world economy that Neil is pointing out are still going to go on. The English language is still going to be an advantage for some time to come. And you had advantages because you speak English, most of you, better than the English do, and certainly better than the Americans do, which again is there. I think what we're hearing here is actually Britain has been quite poor at co-production historically. But actually, when I listen to Mike, I hear that story from other people as well. There's an opening sense of actually we need to be more involved. There's more opportunities there. And the independent model is just as disruptive and problematic in the UK as it is everywhere else. And the answers, if we believe that we're not just waiting for commissions from Netflix, but we believe in independent production, I think co-production models seem more and more essential. And I think what we're hearing is Brexit doesn't necessarily disrupt that. Brexit doesn't stop that, and it certainly doesn't stop the enthusiasm that might be there. So maybe there's opportunities there afterwards. And at the end of it, those cultural links maybe this is one of the good things over the last few years, is people are beginning to understand we have so much more in common with the Dutch than we have with the Americans. It just sometimes takes a pretty giant crisis for us to realise what those cultural links might be. I'll give you one tiny additional thing here. Is every British producer, when they're in their most miserable moments, is constantly talking about moving to somewhere in Europe and moving out. And it's Berlin or the Netherlands, almost always the two. So The Hague is going to be full of British producers. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But remember, we have tons in common. You're like us, just half a metre taller. That's it. And that won't change. Thank you.